back here in Manchester for a morning of all things radio and audio. It's our first tuning in Manchester for a little while, and even longer since we were last here at the Bridgewater Hall. Some of you might remember last time we were here, we were joined by Howard Donald from Take That, donning a bright red Adidas tracksuit, and waxing lyrical about the power of radio, which was a surreal enough experience in itself, but added to by the process of having to navigate the growing band of Take That fans, or Thatters, I think they're known, who are gathering downstairs and obscuring the exit. But look, while I can't promise you pop star royalty today, we do have some great speakers from across the world of radio, podcasting, politics, and advertising. Before I start, just some quick housekeeping. I think we'll be running through to 12:30 today with a short break at 10:45. And just to confirm that we'll be recording today's event, so no need to scribble everything down. We'll be sending you the links to the audio later on. But as I was saying, it's great to be back here and reflect on the success and evolution of radio, especially because, as many of you will know, this year marks 50 years since commercial radio first came to Manchester, with the original Piccadilly Radio breaking new ground as one of the first commercial radio stations outside of London. And we've come a long way since those early days. Fast forward 50 years, and the radio market's changed beyond all recognition, with more choice and competition than ever before, including here in Manchester, which remains a fantastic hub for audio and creativity, and where you can now access more than 50 national commercial stations and over 30 local stations, not to mention an almost infinite choice of music and podcasts. So it's pretty remarkable that commercial radio in the Northwest has actually grown its audience in recent years and now reaches over 5.3 million people each week. More on that in a moment, but first of all, I just want to make a few opening remarks about what we've got coming up, how our agenda all fits together, and how it reflects some of the exciting changes happening in audio, and touch on some of the things that we're doing to make the most of those opportunities and the opportunities that are being created. So in terms of what we've got coming up this morning, as I hope you've seen, we've got some fantastic speakers, including politicians, agencies, broadcasters, and executives working at the leading edge of innovation in audio. We'll hear about plans to support creativity here in Greater Manchester. We'll learn about how audio manages to cut through in an era of distraction, enabling genuine connection with audiences. And as we gear up to the general election, we'll hear about commercial radio's role in providing trusted and reliable news. We'll also explore how advertisers are using technology and music to engage with audiences more effectively. And finally, with the Euros and the Olympics just around the corner, we'll hear about how podcasts are enabling brands to get even closer to the sporting action. And what's great about these sessions is they all relate in some way to at least one of our themes for today. Not only that radio and audio is stronger than ever, but also that it continues to deliver a really powerful impact due to the public value it provides and its connection with audiences. That innovation is driving change and creating more opportunities than ever, especially for advertisers. And that there's a significant and growing evidence base of radio's effectiveness as an advertising medium, with greater creativity at the heart of those campaigns that deliver the best results. And just to illustrate that point, you can see here how our various speakers and their sessions fit into these themes, whether it's the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, talking about the impact of the creative industries, colleagues from Say It Now and Loud Parade about how audio is innovating and evolving, or insight from Global and Radio Centre on different aspects of audio's effectiveness. But before I bring on our first speaker, I just wanted to take stock of where we are in 2024, which will also help explain why those themes are so relevant. As a start point, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that radio starts from a position of relative strength. Over the past 10 years, some media channels have started to struggle as digital media has attracted the lion's share of advertising spend. But despite this unprecedented competition and disruption, commercial radio has actually had an incredible run, increasing revenues in 7 out of the last 10 years. And despite the inevitable dip during COVID, revenues have actually bounced back really strongly and remain ahead of pre-pandemic levels, with 2024 actually also off to a good start, reflecting the growing confidence in the sector. And another reason to believe in radio's enduring powers is the audience figures. Despite the explosion in media and entertainment options, radio listening's at record levels with 50 million people, or 9 out of 10 of us, tuning in each week. With the quality and choice now available on commercial radio also supporting record audiences, adding an extra 1 million listeners in the last year alone and delivering its highest ever audience share. While other audio formats like podcasts and music streaming, while growing in importance, are playing a largely complementary role so far due to the different needs they're able to fulfill for listeners. A further underlying strength of radio is the level of trust it retains amongst both audiences and advertisers. The reliability of news and information on radio is really understood and valued by listeners, no more so actually than during a general election, when we're bombarded with assertions and claims from all quarters. And that's before taking into account the distorting effects of AI and deepfakes, which are obviously going to take that misinformation to another level. So it's telling that radio, in the dark blue on this image, remains the most trusted medium in the vast majority of European countries, something that's been the case for over a decade, with social media and online platforms generally the least trusted. In the UK, we just commissioned our own research, our own consumer survey, looking at the impact and levels of trust in different media in an election year. Interestingly, this appears to back up the other work in this area, with more people trusting radio than any other media. More on that shortly from my colleague Michael Ireland, who will be unveiling the research and the findings from that shortly. Of course, the way people access news and listen to radio has changed significantly in recent years. In audio, this has meant that podcasts and streaming have become increasingly important, but for advertisers considering the best way to use audio, it's always worth remembering that radio represents by far the biggest proportion of commercially accessible audio hours. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is hours where you can actually buy advertising, including non-BBC podcasts, free streaming services, and of course, commercial radio. With commercial radio accounting for 85% of these listening hours, you can see why it remains the centerpiece of those audio advertising campaigns that deliver the biggest impact. Of course, developments in technology have made it much easier to access different types of audio. Initially, MP3 players and smartphones, and increasingly in the last few years through smart speakers with voice activation like the Amazon Alexa. And while these devices offer many functions and will inevitably get even smarter, a lot of the time they're just being used as clever radios. According to Radio Armidus, the vast majority of listening time on these devices, around 70%, is to radio. And radio is embracing the opportunities in these areas, creating more sophisticated advertising solutions, including targeted and actionable ads, which we'll also hear about later. Now, these opportunities are only likely to grow when you look at the share of radio listening now happening online. Up to a record 28% of all listening in the latest radar, and even higher for commercial radio. And as you can see, there's been a real sort of surge in the last few years of radio listening on online platforms, more than doubling actually in the last 4 years alone. And it's smart speaker listening, the orange shade on this chart, that actually appears to be driving that growth. We've only had separate figures for smart speakers since 2022, but this now accounts for 17% of all listening and the majority of online listening. As a result, there's some great opportunities, but radio is also becoming more reliant on tech platforms like Amazon, like Google, to reach audiences. And while these relationships have been pretty positive so far, this creates real risks for the future. For example, what if the platforms look to exploit their position and start charging to carry radio? Or stop providing easy access to radio and divert listeners to their own content? And what happens if Amazon starts to introduce its own ads around radio content? Because of these risks, we've spent a lot of time over the past year or so in Parliament and working with government to try and establish some ground rules on how radio is offered, accessed, and commercialised in future. We were convinced this could be done pretty simply and effectively and in the interests of listeners. But coming up with a solution was only part of the story. We then had to convince the government, work with the opposition on these changes, and convince people that they should become law and get them through Parliament before the next election. Not an easy task, I can tell you. But I'm pleased to say that following a lot of hard work, we managed to secure support for radio in the government's media bill. And despite a last-minute scare a couple of weeks ago when a general election was called, we were delighted that the bill finally passed into law a couple of weeks ago and will now become the Media Act 2024. So what will the Media Act do exactly? Well, it will look to secure the future of radio on voice assistant platforms. Specifically, it'll introduce new obligations on Amazon and Google to ensure that stations are always available and discoverable, that they're provided reliably on request, that there's no fees for making radio available, and that platforms can't start to overlay their own advertising onto radio content. And that broadcasters can choose how their content is served through their sort of default streaming choice, which might be their own app, like a global player or a Rayo, or an aggregator like TuneIn or Radio Player. On a separate note, helping to shape the digital future of audio will also mean working alongside and competing with the BBC across a range of different platforms. And in many ways, that's business as usual. We've always competed fiercely with the BBC for audiences, and we know that competition is a fact of life. But competition also needs to be fair and reasonable and take into account the huge funding and promotional advantages of the BBC. What it shouldn't mean is the BBC launching copycat radio stations that could put commercial services out of business, as they proposed recently, or starting to run advertising across its audio and podcast output that's already been paid for by the license fee. Now, don't get me wrong, the BBC is a great institution. It's got a really important role to play in the future of audio. But it also needs proper guardrails in place, especially as it looks to drive its own digital expansion. So, what do all of these recent developments tell us about the prospects for audio? Well, hopefully, it shows that the fundamentals for radio remain strong, however it's delivered in future. But it also demonstrates that radio is part of a much broader audio market, which is growing in importance. And it's against this backdrop that Radio Centre's been evolving too, to ensure that we're reflecting the changes happening in the world around us, with the publication of a new action plan report last year setting out our vision for the future and announcing a formal change in our remit to represent and promote all forms of audio provided by commercial radio. In short, as was reported at the time, we're not just about linear radio anymore than our members are. So what does that mean in practice? Well, this broader remit is now reflected across all areas of our work, and you can see it in the work about supporting the future of radio online. While our thought leadership and research output is primarily still focused on radio, but within the context of the broader audio world. And as for our marketing and events, well, I think the sessions today are a good example about how we're evolving what we do. Hopefully you can see from what we've got coming up that radio remains our core focus. It's still the heart of what we do and what our members do. But now we're also reflecting the leading role of commercial radio in digital audio, in podcasts, and the creative opportunities across all audio. And this broader perspective that we'll be providing this morning in keeping with our new remit. So that's it from me for now. I hope that gives you a flavour of what's coming up and why, how this reflects some of the bigger issues in radio and audio, and how commercial radio is evolving as part of this. Thanks for listening.